I'm delighted to introduce today's guest, the incredibly accomplished Michael Jordan, who is a distinguished professor at UC Berkeley and has made, as I mentioned earlier, significant contributions to the field of AI, and in 2016 was named one of the most influential computer scientists worldwide. An article, I believe, was in Science magazine. And I was checking Google Scholar this morning and see that Professor Jordan has over 250,000 citations. I can see my notes there. It was 250,301 to be exact. I'm sure that number just went up. He's also a member of many distinguished associations, including being a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, and has been a recipient of many awards, including the Ulf Bernander Prize from the American Mathematical Society that was in 2021, and the IEEE John von Neumann Medal in 2020. Professor Jordan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Now, that's quite the impressive CV, or resume, as they say here in the US. But knowing a little bit about your background, your research, and your interest, my guess that your journey to machine learning has been anything but linear. Can you tell us a little bit about what's influenced your journey, so to speak?
Yeah, great question. It's a journey, and partly the size of my CV reflects the fact that I'm a little bit old, and I'm an academic, so it's been it's a lifestyle where I don't have any boss, and I get to choose what I do. So sort of every 5 years, I head off and work on something rather different than what I did before, just so I can kind of get a bigger picture. What's the landscape? Where are things going? What are the pieces that are going to be needed? What are we kind of trying to assemble here? So yeah, it's I'm more excited now than I've ever been, and the topics I'm working on, I think, are really important and fun to work on and impactful. But I can't even hardly remember how I got started. But when you're 18 or 20, you're kind of interested in, at least I was interested in, philosophical issues about what's thinking and how's the brain work and so on. And I still think those questions are fantastically important to think about and interesting. But they are still rather philosophical. And I eventually became more of an engineer and more of a person wanting to have real world impact and contribute to science and technology in our era. And so that kind of helped shape what I've done.
Great. And let's kind of get into it here. Definitely want to talk more about your research. And I think you're on sabbatical right now and what you're working on, or rather not working on. But what is your definition of machine learning? Because in the number of talks I've attended where you presented, I've heard you say it's a blend of pattern recognition and decision making, which is very insightful. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I don't really, first of all, I'm not going to have a definition, and I'm going to kind of say why.
Yeah.
But, pattern recognition has been the focus of the last 10 years, or it's certainly the thing that people talk most about, finding patterns in large, vast collections of data and making those patterns be useful for various purposes. But there is a whole other side of the field, which is consequential decision making. How do I ensure that I don't make huge errors when I make decisions? How do I put various decisions together, various people together, multiple agents, and then how do I think about doing this over time, not just over an hour or a day, but over, months or years? So that's kind of a little bit of a flavor of what machine learning is, what some of its big themes are. But I don't think it's really a field yet. And I say that when I think historically about what are the predecessors in human history that are like this era, and I think it's really the emergence of a brand new engineering field. And I actually looked into chemical engineering a little bit. It emerged in the 30s and 40s, and before that there wasn't a field called chemical engineering really. There was chemistry, there was quantum mechanics. It was understood there was fluid flow. There was understood what happened in a test tube if you put molecules together, what would form. But the idea that you could actually build something out in a field, a factory, that at huge scale would take in inputs and produce products, and eventually produce brand new kinds of products like plastics and very useful medical products and so on and so forth. That was not at all clear that could be done in the 30s and 40s. And so people started to do it. They started to take what they knew about chemistry and fluid flow and thermodynamics and all. They started to build these big, you know, factories, and some of them just worked fine, and some of them, probably most of them, didn't work. They didn't produce product at all, or they produced something different, or they just didn't work at all, or they exploded and hurt people. And over time, new principles emerged, how to put things together, modular ways of thinking about an engineering problem. Control theory kind of emerged partly because of that era. And so that the field eventually got called chemical engineering, and it obviously changed our world. And if you go back further, electrical engineering, very similar. Before there was electrical engineering, around 1880, there were already Maxwell's equations, so it was already understood what the phenomenon was. But the ability to bring electricity across a city, or to wire a house, or to build a circuit, or to do communications, radio, those were all things that were not envisaged yet, and people started to try to do them, and it was hard. And eventually, principles emerged to support that. And I think that's very much parallel to our current era. We have this rough idea that, with lots of data, we can find patterns, make predictions, we can imitate humans, we can do this at large scale, at planetary scale. We can bring things together never brought together before. So we're building factories in some sense that are, large scale, planetary scale factories that use data as kind of their raw ingredients, but also human knowledge and human aspirations. And we build systems that hopefully work, that do something. They do commerce, they do transportation, they do education, entertainment, or whatever. And so those are kind of our modern factories. And I think the analogy goes even further. They're partly working and they're partly not working. And we don't really quite have yet the principles of how do we build these things? How do we make sure they're safe? How to make sure they scale, they work for 10 years, they don't hurt anybody, they privacy issues and so on. And just to kind of close that line of argument, the previous waves, developments of engineering fields is sort of every 50 years, have changed our world more than just about anything I can think of. It was supported by science, but the engineering fields were the ones that really impacted human life. And so that includes, civil engineering as well, building buildings and bridges, and mechanical engineering, and so on. This is the first engineering field where humans are inside the engineering discipline. We're not just designing it. It's about humans, and it's about human data, and it's about human values and culture and business models and all that. So it's probably the most challenging engineering field ever thought of and envisaged. And so I think that's actually what AI/machine learning is right now. Other people have different definitions from kind of academia, or from what people aspire to do. Like AI, people aspire to have thought in a computer. That's not what's happened. We don't have thought in a computer, and it's a fine aspiration. Nothing wrong with it, but it's not what's happened. And I think what's happened is instead this kind of large scale building of large systems in brand new ways, and we still don't really know what the principles will be of the emerging field. So that's a long answer. I hope you saw in there something of that approaches a definition. But I think if you'd asked someone back in 1930, what is the definition of chemical engineering, they wouldn't have been able to say, and they wouldn't have captured what was going to happen over the next few decades. And similarly for electrical engineering.
No, very, very good answer. Very illuminating answer, Professor Jordan. Now, you gave a talk back in ODSC in 2019. You just gave a recent one, but this is going back a few years, pre-COVID. About blending machine learning and microeconomics, and I was very fascinated by that talk. Has your thinking evolved since then due to the advance in the field of machine learning? First, we just talked about large language models and all that good stuff, but the economic impact of COVID, especially the behavior, as we saw, of individuals and companies during that period of time. So just curious, like looking back from 2019 to now, if your thinking has evolved somewhat or changed due to these more recent developments.
My thinking hasn't changed due to the chat GTP and all that. I mean, I think that's fantastically interesting and exciting. And I didn't, I knew that eventually, pattern recognition would get better and better and better. I think it went, faster than most of us would have imagined. But the whole other side of building new markets and producer-consumer relationships with data, that hadn't changed at all. In fact, it's kind of clear to me that it's even more pertinent, and the challenges are even more interesting. And we made a lot of progress. So thinking about asymmetric information situations where you have a principal and an agent, and you're trying to get the agents to do things, but they don't reveal their data because it's not in their interest to do so. Thinking about market building exercises where you have a two-sided market. Those are all very, very pertinent in real life, and thinking about business models, and thinking about what could be the socially useful aspects of this new technology. It's more and more pertinent. So maybe just to give a concrete example, this one I've used, I think, perhaps in the talk. I've been involved with a friend and colleague who's in the music business, leader, a Ludian producer and an entrepreneur named Steve Stout, helping create a company called United Masters, and it uses data analysis, machine learning, two-way market kind of thinking, to link musicians to the people who are listening to them and link them to brands. So a musician, instead of just putting a song up that's being streamed on a platform and the platform makes money from advertising or a subscription, instead the musician gets to know who's listening to their music by seeing a dashboard. And they are associated with brands who will actually hire them and pay them when their music is being used. So United Masters has over 2 million musicians signed up. They create their music. It's on that platform. And for example, the National Basketball Association uses United Masters music now behind its clips. And whenever you watch a clip and some music is being played, it's going to be probably by a 16-year-old or a 19-year-old, not by a famous musician. And the 16-year-old or 19-year-old is getting paid when you watch that clip. So it's literally a three-way market. There's producers who are the musicians, and then again, they're often young people who are making the exciting music on their home laptop that a lot of people are listening to. And those musicians are their music is being produced and then made available to the NBA. It's being used. The NBA is paying the musician. And then the listeners are people like us who are also connected to the musician. We can have our favorite musicians, and there's more of a direct connectivity between musicians and listeners. So that model, to support that, there's a lot of kind of economics thinking about incentives, about long tails, about how does data get used here? How do you achieve fairness? How do you achieve a healthy market? And thinking that through has kind of led to a company that's really quite viable and is not using advertising as its key way to make money. It's instead building an actual market. So anyway, that gives a little flavor of that's on the non-technical side. This is more on the, if you go out in the real world, you see new companies kind of thinking about what their business model is. And often I think it's better to think about, well, who are my producers? Who are my consumers? And maybe my goal should be to kind of do lots of data analysis so I link them in the best possible way. And in economics, these are called matching markets. But in economics, there wasn't much data analysis to support the matching market. It was just that everyone had preferences and you matched people based on their preferences, like in college admissions. But we have this new world emerging where we don't know our preferences are. I don't know what musicians I prefer. I have to experience them a bit. But as I experience them, I start to become linked, and economic value can flow based on that. So it's a very different way of thinking about what machine learning can be done on a platform. It's a little more close to what like a commerce company does. So like Amazon, their business model was originally to ship packages between producers and consumers. I mean, they still do quite a bit of that, but advertising wasn't the main component of that. It was literally help the packages flow and then take a cut of that as the business model. So I think that's a better model, or it's an interesting model to consider for our field. Its job is to support the building of producer-consumer markets at hitherto unthought of scales. Millions to billions of people being connected in various ways.
Yeah, and I think that's amazingly insightful, because my background is electrical engineering. Then I went to quant finance, to data science, to machine learning. And it was only when I started listening to your talk in 2019, I really started to think about these two-sided markets, because it made me realize the system I was building, it was a single agent system where only that agent knew about the data was coming in, running those models, that the consumers, user on the other side, there was no agent acting on their behalf, right? And so I think, this whole concept you had brought to my attention of two-sided marketplaces within the system design was extremely interesting. And I think that's a great example you just gave about that music industry where the person has an actual dashboard. So do you see companies, tuning to this more? Because like just the ChatGPT, by the way, everyone's saying it's a red line for Google for their ad revenue. And to me, again, people are thinking about these technologies in the same way. So any thoughts on that? That people are.
Well, I mean, I nothing bad to say about ChatGPT. I think there's there will eventually be a business model there, and I'm perhaps not smart enough to know exactly what that'll be. But they're when you think about business models, advertising and subscription based just can't be the way the world runs. It just can't be our future.
Right.
As the main way to make these things useful to people. And so you ask about companies. Yeah, companies are already doing this kind of market, style thinking. And so I spend the day a week at Amazon. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor, I mean, they've been doing machine learning going back to the 90s, early 90s, really, or mid 90s, to find patterns, but then also to do logistics decisions and so on.
Right.
But one of the things that Amazon does is they have something called FBA, furnished by, or fulfillment by Amazon. So if you're, you produce some product somewhere and you don't want to do all the inventory management and stockpiling yourself or the shipping and all that, so you let Amazon do that for you. And so you send a bunch of your items to Amazon and then they handle the rest. Well, now you have various decisions to make about how much inventory do you keep and when do you get rid of the inventory, what prices you set, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Amazon doesn't really know how to do that themselves they don't know the product that well, right? And so they could ask the producer, how much is your product worth, or make a prediction and everything. But the user is actually not incentivized, or the producer is not incentivized to tell Amazon, because if they tell them, they can get a cheaper price if they kind of hedge a little bit, right? And this is how all of us are. If an insurance company is coming after you, wants to sell me insurance, health insurance, they're going to set a price and they're going to ask me some questions like, how much do you drink? And I'm going to say, well, I don't drink at all. Or how much exercise do you do? Well, I do a lot of exercise, right? And so economists have thought about this a lot. These are the problems of information asymmetries and incentive structures. And how can you set things up so that both sides actually get the best out of a deal under these asymmetry conditions? Whereas the kind of the current machine learning style thinking, the federated learning, the ChatGPT doesn't consider these issues. It just says, well, I can gather data wherever I want to. I can go and grab everybody's data on the web and I flow it back centrally to me. I build my model and then I make it available, and then hopefully I make money. Well, that's just such a limited perspective. That's not how the world wants to run. The world wants to have agents who possess something of value. Maybe their own data is valuable. Maybe they don't want to give it to Google, not just because they want to be paid, but also there's competitive reasons, or there's privacy reasons, or there's just if I don't give you my data, or if I lie a little bit, I'll get a better benefit. And those aren't perverse incentives; those are real incentives. That's what happens in real life. So if you don't take that stuff into account, you're going to build stuff that just in some sense is as a toy, or makes money for a small number of people, like it did for Google in the search engine, but is missing out on all the real big opportunities. So I do think that ChatGPT aside, just thinking about how do you use machine learning in the real world, it's things more like this, FBA or something. It's more like somebody wants to do a service. There's some other people out there that they want to engage with, but information just doesn't flow because you want it to. You have to incentivize and you have to structure a deal. In economics, you have these things called contracts, which are lists of if this happens, then this happens. If this happens, then happens. It's not just here's a price. It's rather here's a price if this happens, and so on. And then you get to choose in the menu. So it's like business class, economy class on an airplane. They don't just give you one price; they give you a menu of options. And the reason is because, of course, there's more people will get on the flight, and everybody will be happier, because of the menu of options rather than a single price. And I don't hear machine learning people talking about those issues, about how do we structure the output of our system so that it's a incentive compatible mechanism of some kind in the real world. And so that to me is really exciting, because I do know businesses do talk this language, and they use classical microeconomics, but they don't have any machine learning in their microeconomics. They assume everything's already known a priori, and then they structure their contract or their auction or whatever, and they assume the distribution's already known, and and they go from there. Well, we have this huge opportunity. Machine learning can learn the ingredients of the mechanism, be it a contract or a matching market or an auction or whatever, or develop new kinds of mechanisms that have been talked about. So to me, this is kind of where machine learning really starts to make an impact on the real world, on companies and business models, and and humans as they relate to other humans. And just as more exciting to me than ChatGPT, frankly. ChatGPT is great, it's interesting, it's a tool, but I'm more excited in this. How do you get people to meet up with other people kind of issues?
No, you bring up some excellent points there, and your earlier points about the insurance company example. To this day, I'm still amazed with engineers who have blind faith in essentially what is data quality, because despite how much we know about bias in this many forms, years ago I used to work at a polling company in the UK doing political polling, and they talked a lot about social desirability bias, like when you're asking questions about who do you want to vote for and who do you not want to vote for and things like that, and people would respond to those questions in a way that they believe is socially acceptable or desirable, rather than their true thoughts, right, or feelings. So as practitioners, and I know some people are aware of these problems, but this is where you have a bias and then you introduce bias to overcome that bias. So how do we as practitioners tackle some of these problems? Because these are not easy issues to tackle, because for reasons mentioned.
Well, you did a great job of outlining some of the issues. I mean, just to say, these are issues that things like insurance companies or banks who are trying to give people loans have tackled. It's not as if they can't be tackled, and they have their the ways of doing it. Sometimes they're like multiple paths or several stages of commit. Sometimes they ask questions that are harder. So if they ask me how much I exercise, I can say I exercise a huge amount. If they say, show me a receipt from a gym as one evidence that you exercise, well, that's a little harder for me to fake. And so, you do things that are, build up trust over time so that, there's a commitment partially made and that incentivizes you to do certain actions you wouldn't have otherwise done. And there's all sorts of, these are called mechanisms. There's all sorts of strategies. There's usually not just kind of one, price or one output. It's a process. And in real world auctions, for example, this happens too, like the auction of spectrum. You don't just run a English auction and you're done. It's a whole sequence of things that happen. And when we as humans go into something like a real world market, if I go into a bazaar in Northern Africa, I don't know much about the world there. It's very complicated, all kinds of things I've never seen before, but I get some idea of how to interact, and I maybe probe a little bit. I try. And I do eventually get value out of it, and I bring value to the market. And so humans are very, adept at actually sensing how to interact in these environments and build up just enough trust so that they can do something, so that something else happens. And so you have to structure these engagements. You have to think ahead a little bit. And in worst case thinking is probably not the right way to go. Someone could arbitrarily lie. But you can sort of sense that, or you can also structure it such that an arbitrary lie is kind of not going to get anybody what they want. So anyway, there is a field called economics, which microeconomics, which thinks about this a lot. But like I say, the big opportunity is that they haven't used it in this iterative context of bringing in data and analyzing data, which is what we real humans do in a real market. We don't just go in with our preferences already known. We sample, we try, we talk, we discuss. We have social networks that permit data to flow in interesting ways and helpful ways. And all those things aren't part of classical microeconomics.
Right.
So that's a huge problem-solving opportunity. Bring those in, and now what can you do? Well, you can do a lot more, and they're going to be highly relevant things. So incentives are important to talk about. And when data is being gathered, you have to be aware there's quote-unquote bias. And some of it's inadvertent, some of it's the way you gather the data, but some of it is that you have to think that your incentives to make sure you have some control over the bias.
And Professor Jordan, you mentioned banking and insurance. These are heavily regulated markets, right?
Yeah.
And we hear a lot about the need to regulate AI. Do you think there's a need for government regulation for AI in the context of the framework which you're outlining?
Well, there's definitely a need for regulation. There's always going to be a need for regulation for any sufficiently powerful technology. No question. There's regulation of electrical engineering, of electricity, of chemical engineering, and so on and so forth. But and this is not my level of area of expertise. So just to be clear, what kind of regulation and when it comes in and how is it most helpful and productive is not at all clear to me, certainly, and I think to most people. I don't think it's a good idea to regulate too early because you really don't know what the phenomenon is. And we say AI as if we know what we're talking about. And as I kind of alluded to, I don't think we do. I don't think we know what AI is going to be over the next couple of decades. And so regulation, I think, needs to be kind of gentle. If you regulate, you can be at cross purposes and you can regulate and create perverse incentives and so on and so forth. And that I'm sure is going to happen. It'd be better if it somehow didn't. So I would say, we have to be careful and be gentle about it. But then eventually we realize what needs to be regulated, regulate. You can't just go put a wire in a house. There's regulations on how you install it and how you, and that has to be the case here. But again, I just don't think we entirely know. If you say, I'm going to regulate, insist that you have, zero bias estimators, well, that's a meaningless thing to say. If you say, I'm going to have perfect privacy, that's a meaningless thing to say. So for example, privacy, to me, it's an economic concept. I don't want absolute privacy. I want to be able to give up a little privacy, supply some data about myself if I get some benefit in return. So if I enter into a market and I reveal something about myself of kind of maybe things that, if it's like a restaurant market and I reveal I like Sichuan cuisine and I like to pay about $20 and I, blah, blah, blah. Then I'll get something in return, which is I'll get good offers from the other side of the market of things that I value. And so I've given up a little privacy for a particular purpose. And that's, I think, the way to forward with privacy. It's to, in part, bring it into the economics of it's a trade-off of give up something, get something, quantify that, make it like a currency. There's a little risk and I get it some benefit. And so we don't know what that language exactly is yet. And so regulating and say as if we already know what privacy is and we already know what AI is, and we're going to impose that. I think at this point it would be mostly counterproductive, although a little bit of pressure, pure libertarian open development technology is dangerous itself. So a little bit, but gentle.
Exactly. And so talking about privacy, which is a big concern, one of the reasons we need to regulate AI. You mentioned federated learning in one of your talks as well, and I know that you co-authored a paper last year on incentivizing data sharing and federated learning. And the promise of federated learning allows us to, we want to have models that are trained on decentralized data from, say, different companies who have different requirements on that data, and without the need to centralize and share this sensitive data. So you and your co-authors propose a new framework. So I think you've already kind of touched upon why you think that's necessary, but I would love if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
I think nowadays, in fact, it's often started to be called collaborative learning, just to kind of change the dialogue a little bit. One model is the classical federated learning. It was, that terminology was first used by people at Google. Even though some of the ideas had already been presented in papers that were outside of Google, just to say. But they gave it that name, and their model was that they were Google. They were trying to collect huge amounts of data to build a centralized model, indeed. And the economic, side of that was completely implicit. You assumed that people were just willing to give up their data. You assumed that they were going to give up true data, that they weren't going to shade it in some way. And you assume that this centralized model would be immediately of value to everybody. And there would be a business model, et cetera. There's many economics assumptions that are completely implicit. I'm not saying they're wrong, but they're implicit. And I think a better way to think about, construe the whole problem is to think more about the edge. Who's on the edge? Is it just devices or is it actual agents? And do they possess data they care about? And it's not just privacy. So, if I possess medical data, yes, I might think of it as private, but also I'd like to think about, well, what is this central site going to do with my medical data? Are they going to study a disease that runs in my family, for example? Well, then I'm all in. Or are they going to use it to set insurance rates? Well, then maybe I'll help out a little bit, but I'm not all in. or if they're just going to use it to, to make money off of advertising, maybe I'm not in at all. So I like to have a knob to turn that it reflects my level of engagement, and then like I talked about with the asymmetry of information, the principal agent model. Well, I'm an agent, and I don't want to just give Google some information that Google, wants, because I want to, work with Google. I maybe want to, get something. They want something out of me. I want something out of them, and we need to make that all explicit, and it has to go back and forth. Moreover, there's free writing issues. I mean, I have some, something to give Google and some data perhaps, but I know that you have, very much the same data I have, and I know if you supply data to Google, maybe I don't have to. Then I have no risk. And so there's got to be a way to think, there's free riding as a concept again in economics. Like how do you avoid it? How do you make sure that things are shared? How do you deal with public goods where it's supposedly a benefit to everybody? And then how do you ensure that actual benefit does, accrue to people? And benefit is not just that there's a big model out there available. Benefit, it may be more localized and more heterogeneous. So I may have some data that's really pertinent to my local situation. But sure, if I could take, a million other people's data and bring it in, that would even be better. I could, I could have a model that was better for everybody, but also for me locally. And my needs are maybe a little different than yours. So this would be heterogeneous federated learning, or really, again, what I think of as collaborative learning. We're trying to kind of collaborate. We allow things to be shared so that, locally I can do something even better than I would do, but my thing is different than yours. And so that model is more focused on what happens at the edge and the value accrued to that, and diminishing the role of the central platform. And again, I think the model of federated learning has been more focused on the central platform. What do they get out of it? And the value that then they accrue that again, supposedly helps all of us. But hopefully that's clear that, yes, I think there's a broader topic here, and it's a really important one. And it's got to be, in most situations, you have to think about active agents on the edge, not just mere devices that stream data, and not just privacy is your one limitation that has an economic side to it.
Again, very insightful. So as we know, last year was quite the interesting one in the world of AI. DALL-E 2 generated a lot of noise, as did Stable Diffusion, and people creating very interesting things like the last selfie of humanity. But it kind of pales to comparison to the excitement and the excitement and the angst generated by ChatGPT, which we talked about a few times. And just reading a little bit yesterday about everyone gathering at Davos this year. I guess that's back on now after 2 years hiatus, or last year was scaled down. It was interesting, like everyone I'm talking to is using it. My kids are using it. Got to find out what they're using it for. But it was interesting, this article mentioned that all the CEOs at Davos are talking about ChatGPT, using themselves. And the angst here is these CEOs of very powerful companies, as well as world government leaders, are all over this. So what advice would you offer them as they kind of rush into this, what they view as a new dawn for AI? But for most of us working in the field, it's an improvement in pattern recognition, as you mentioned. So what advice would you offer them if you had to address the world stage at Davos, so to speak, which you may be? I'm not sure. I don't know all your agenda, Professor Jordan, but what advice would you offer them if you're in that position?
Well, I don't have a lot of sympathy for, a company that has been out of the loop, fine. It's a new tool that's very powerful. And if you weren't already ready to use it and think about it, that's too bad for you. So I watched IBM, with Watson, and they just were not going to solve the problem that they really were claiming in all their big advertisements they were solving. So I felt, too bad for you guys. And if now GPT just makes them look silly, which I think it does, that's all the better for whoever is going to come on and use, maybe it's Microsoft at this point is coming back. And if Google's search engine is kind of now diminished, I've got no problem with that. I was very happy. Google, I think, helped change our world, made it a better place in the 90s.
Yeah.
But that didn't mean that Google's got to be, for the rest of our lives or the rest of my children's lives, the dominant force in the world. I'm very much a capitalist in that sense. That made the better product win. Yeah. So a little less facetiously, I think it's it's clear there's some business models to be built here. But it's just like, Uber, was a brand new business model. It kicked out some, some aspect of the previous transportation model, and people had to adapt and scramble. And some companies perhaps went under. Overall, the effect on human life was probably favorable. It's not, it's still to be written, the history, but a lot of us have gotten around on Uber very, very effectively in ways we didn't get around in taxis. That's probably good. And I think that, if I just think of the search engine, it's been great for 30 years or whatever. But, using an interface like this where I can talk to it a little bit more and it can kind of, craft a response for me, that's great. I don't see how you're going to make money off of that right now. I hope it's not just pure advertising play. I kind of think we've had enough of that. But on the other hand, it's not, I think the people at Davos are probably, not able to kind of construe where the line is. What can this do? What can it not do? I think those of the field mostly still feel that there is a big difference between a real human interaction and a GPT-3 one. And it's some of it'll just kind of go away over time. But there definitely is a missingness. You can't interact it with, over long periods of time in the same way you can with a human, right? A human, well, you and I are building up a model of each other. We're building up a model of the things we're talking about in the world, and that model is real. It's just not in the statistics. It's real, and it's a novel model to reflect novel things around us, and we refer to it in our conversations, and it's kind of there. With ChatGPT-3, that model is not there, and so it's talking about things that could be true, that sound great. It could be true in some possible world. That doesn't mean it's true in our world. All right. And at some point you'll get frustrated with that. You'll sort of say, well, ChatGPT-3, that sounds really good, but it sounds like bullshit to me. And it'll say, oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, that's bullshit. Here's something that's maybe less likely to be bullshit. And so, can you fix that? Well, at some point it gets to be hard. There's little things that you can fix. People have kind of said, here, it does something stupid here. Well, the engineers of whatever company eventually try to monetize this will fix every little use case. Just like with the self-driving cars right now, they're not on the road, really. Why? Well, because there's all these little use cases they kind of screw up in, right? And so it'll take another 10 years for some engineers to spend all their lifetimes fixing up every edge case. And I think that's true with ChatGPT-3. There'll be all these little edge cases where it doesn't do the right thing. So fix it up so it does okay in that situation. And this kind of goes a little, against the spirit of just machine learning does everything. But it's kind of adding in the right data and engineering. And in some sense, well, any engineering system has got to be this way, like a chemical factory. But it's kind of less glamorous, and it's also kind of clear that you're sort of cheating at that point. It's going to be just kind of fixing it up so it does some purpose. It's not solving the underlying problem of what is the truth and how do I get at the truth in a conversation, and how do I model what's really happening in the world or in the social environment that we're talking about. So that'll take some decade or so to kind of patch use cases. And I think the real serious interactions between humans, we'll still want them to be with humans, because there is just I think we'll have come to a better appreciation of human intelligence through all this. By the way, we're not going to be just satisfied with something that sounds good. We're going to want something that really we know has been thought through, that it reflects a lifetime experience, that reflects maybe some position. Someone, if we sense that they're trying to sell us on something, that's maybe good or bad, but they're trying to do something. Whereas ChatGPT-3, it's not clear what it's trying to do. We want to know that something's being attempted there. And so I think we'll appreciate more what humans are about. Also, the kind of the creative abilities you mentioned, like the image generation stuff. And you can generate images, you could generate songs, you could generate books. They'll all you have their use, generating marketing copy or generating stuff for legal cases and so on. Why not? But I still think that most of us will want to read a real book or hear a real song from a human. When I say real, reflecting the human experience, the cultural experience behind it, but also thinking the ability to reason in the moment and bring in ideas that were not in the data, and in new ways, which that's part of the agenda of AI. And I think in 100 years we'll have all the above from AI, but we won't have that in this Davos, conversation. We won't have that in the next 5 years. And so instead, be really clear on what it is, but what it is not. And be clear, there will be lots of fakery. There'll be lots of people saying, well, I got a system that will, help you with, your stock investments and all that. And you can have a conversation with it. Well, just be clear that thing is not really understanding something about the real world. And medical, discussions. It's not really understanding medicine and biology. And so be clear that what you're getting there. Use it as a tool. I can imagine with a doctor, you'll want to have a doctor and ChatGPT-3 and yourself in the room, and you're all discussing, the three of you, and you're using it as a tool, just like people use X-rays as a tool at some point. But you won't trust the output of that alone. You will want the interpretation from the doctor and the dialogue that you have with the doctor, bringing in context and facts that were not in the data originally that ChatGPT-3 just doesn't know about. So in that sense, it's a very useful tool in the room, but it is not going to, replace humans in many, many, many situations.
Yeah, no, I think it's an absolutely brilliant tool. They'll definitely work on improving the well-known hallucination issue. But I think when I've had discussions with people about ChatGPT, I take a kind of a different approach to it, because to me, it's, again, brilliant tool, but it's a somewhat established paradigm, because I go back to, I think it was an ODSC talk you gave, but you gave a brilliant example. So I use an app called Waze, which is helps you get places quicker. It shows you shortcuts and routes like that. But sometimes when I use it in the morning during rush hour, of course, everyone else is on it because everyone else is using Waze. And then you have the bias from like, well, if it's redlining, how long ago was that? That was probably 20 minutes ago, and the data is not catching up with what's actually going on in the real world. But I go back, I think you gave a great example about restaurants. Restaurant example, like you see these recommendation systems, and again, Amazon, Uber, Netflix have done a great job on that. They're recommending all these products and services, but they're recommending them to everybody because there's no agent acting on their side. And essentially you have the same problem in ChatGPT, right? Because I'm asking ChatGPT, it's no context of who I am as a person. So just like you said, building up these models and excellent pattern recognition. And that's kind of the limitations here, where a lot of these people are not seeing that, because I've started to look at now, like, and again, there's all kinds of issues around, having your own agents, your own data. Like, for the most part, we're giving our data away now for free. It's not like we can build our own agents, our own models to act on our behalf, just like you gave in that really good example around the media industry. But isn't that kind of like the fundamental issue here, that these systems can get better and better, but they have an essential limitation due to, which you've already discussed, context, building up that relationship with a person, knowing what their choices are. And now it comes to me, I think it was like, because it hit me, because I think you mentioned you like Indian food. I happen to like Indian food, but I might be going to a Chinese restaurant because my friends want Chinese all the time. And then all of a sudden, I'm finally with someone who agrees to go to an Indian restaurant with me. And so stop recommending me Chinese restaurants because I actually like Indian food. So yeah, so I'd love if you can expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, that you're getting at, I mean, I'm not, it's not clear this has that much to do with ChatGPT-3 per se, which is just an NLP, device. But the situation there was recommendation systems where you could imagine AI's job is just to recommend really great things to us because it knows everything about us, right? So it recommends where everybody should go to eat in a restaurant. First of all, if it does what current recommendation systems do, it just kind of independently gives a recommendation to everybody. In the real world, you have scarcity. You can't just do that, because if you send 10,000 people to the same restaurant, you're going to create congestion. Or if you send 10,000 people down the same street, you're going to create traffic. And so, okay, you can't do that. So the centralized AI system, therefore, has got to do load balancing and only send certain people to certain restaurants. Well, if its job is to be the centralized authority for all of our wishes and values, it has to take in all of our data and decide who gets to go to what restaurant. And now you can just sort of start to see the implausibility of this. This is not what we want. It's not going to work. It's not going to be effective. It's not going to be fair. It's going to sense, we'll all be suspicious that somehow the prized people get to go to certain restaurants and we don't. And so it's got to be much more of a situation like a market, which is that, I push a button on my cell phone saying, hey, I'm ready to eat dinner. And the other side of the market, which is all the restaurants, take in all the, the requests from everybody and they get to know something about the people. They get to say, oh, I see what kind of food you tend to like in the past, and where you're located, and what your price point seems to be, and I also have my own preferences, like people from out of town or whatever. That now we're talking about a real market where there's kind of back and forth, and a mix of desires of various kinds. There's a social network which will I will get some information maybe from other people that are also in the market. And now there's going to be kind of maybe some bids made. I'll get a bing on my cell phone that a certain restaurant says, hey, we'll make you a 10% discount offer if you come within the next 10 minutes. And I'll look at it, but then I still have agency. I get to decide, will I accept that bid or not? And you're right. At that point, I might say, well, look, based on all my past history, yeah, you would have thought I loved Indian food. But there's some context that you're not aware of because it's not in the past date at all that I'm aware of that makes me not want to eat Indian food tonight, and try something different. And all of us want that kind of agency in all of our life's decisions. We don't want some big AI agent telling us what to do because it thinks it knows us. And because it can't know us, really. It can't know us in the moment, how we'll react in the moment. All the world's past data is not going to do that. And so I do push back against my AI colleagues, often talk about prediction systems, predictions, everything. If you can predict perfectly, we got AI. And that's just wrong. It's critically wrong. You can't have all the world's data that's relevant to any specific decision, because if you're thinking about that decision, there's stuff that you never even realized was relevant that becomes suddenly highly relevant. And so a market way of thinking about it like that is more relevant here, because markets are more slippery. They're more, you reason in the moment, you interact back and forth. And real values are talked about. Bids and values are real things I'm willing to pay for, and so on. So that's, to me, the better way to start to think about it. It handles the load balancing issues because it allows us to bid, and I'll pay more for something. Well, that's maybe because I have a reason to pay more. And so those two threads of thinking have got to come together. And AI is just so dominated discourse. If the Davos people are talking about it so much, why aren't they also talking about matching markets? And why aren't they talking about payment systems? Why aren't they talking about,
exactly,
medical care and so on? Why so much about natural language processing? It's kind of amazing to me that that there's this exuberance, and it's really the Frankenstein exuberance. It's humans creating humans, human lookalikes, and people find that fascinating, which I understand. But at some level, after the little bit of the fascination wears off, let's be real, folks. Let's talk about what we're, let's make human life better and safer, more interesting, all that, and being Frankensteins and creating our monsters, and hoping that our monsters will be good and will do, solve problems for us. I find that amazing naivete.
Yes, Professor Jordan, again, brilliantly astute observations, but let's wrap this up with a final question. As an academic at Berkeley, I know your students are always coming to you for advice, and putting aside the 1% of the 1% at Davos, for lots of people listening to this show, whether they're just beginning their journey into AI, they may be machine learning AI practitioners, but even for people in various industries, doesn't matter if it's finance, energy, education. I think we have someone on here from the tourism industry that may be enthusiastic about what's coming in AI and also have angst against it. What's your advice for them in dealing with the future of AI?
Well, I mean, first of all, for a younger person, I just say continue to educate yourself, just like in the past. The steam engine came along, in 1830 or whatever. There was a lot of angst and anxiety about, things lost. But, people that sort of studied, power and how what you could do with it, we're ready to do new things. And similarly here, if you just kind of appreciate what it is and what it's not, and it doesn't take that long, you can start to envisage a life where you incorporate it and you build around it, and you just have confidence that if you do something valuable, like you create music or you create art or you create architecture, or you could decorate homes or whatever, that you're not going to be replaced. I mean, that's what humans want from other humans, and this will empower you maybe to do more and do it in different ways. Just like any tool in the past, the X-ray machine empowered people to look in new ways and do different things. And this is that kind of thing. It definitely, it makes us kind of, our mind kind of explodes a little bit when we think about, okay, the college essay may be, outmoded now, because, a student can literally have this thing write an essay for them, And in the moment, if I'm a teacher looking at 30 essays, I'm not in the classical human situation of being in an environment, in a context, and having an interaction going on for several days or months where I can really evaluate if something's good or not. It's like 30 out of context essays, and that's first of all, it's kind of artificial. And so educations have to adjust. They can't do that anymore, or not in the same way, at least. And you try to get, students can only sit in the room. They can't have access to a computer. They have to write their essay. Probably that helps. We still want to be able to write these essays that are somewhat out of context and just deliver them quickly. But also you got to set up different situations where maybe a human kind of has to learn something over time, and you watch an essay evolve over longer periods of time. And you see things that, that it would be hard to fake. And you have to restructure education. So a thoughtful education person would start to do that. Say, okay, the college essay is broken, it's gone. But look, the need is still there to educate people how to express themselves. Let's think of a different way to do that and evaluate it. Don't be afraid of that. Embrace the novelty. Someone in the tourism industry, there are new things that you can do here. You're trying to give descriptions of trips you could take or whatever. Well, use this tool, but shape it by what's on the ground. So in fact, I like to give I think it's a perfect example of a market. Suppose I'm traveling to Sri Lanka next week, right? And I have a couple of free days. I'd like to find out things I could do to attract me to hang out in Sri Lanka and do more things. Well, I don't want ChatGPT writing a little document for me. It's probably not going to know. I would like some human being who's living in Sri Lanka who knows the facts on the ground about what's cool this week in Sri Lanka for people like me. Okay. And again, ChatGPT doesn't know the truth. It doesn't know what's on the ground, at least current versions. And I think that will take quite some time. It could consult with a human on the ground there and ask, hey, is there a cool concert going on of this kind? And the human, it could maybe look that up in databases and all, but there will be, a human on the other side, mostly, to get the truth. And then a document comes back to me that's been prepared kind of in the moment, a 2-pager on the cool things to do for someone like, a 60-year-old of academic in Sri Lanka who likes to go running and likes music. And it comes to me and I look at it and I say, fantastic. And I pay for that, right? I pay, $100. I mean, that's valuable to me. And we've already agreed a priori, I'm going to pay that amount. And that's different from YouTube. That's different from just tourist industry copy. That's a more human producer-consumer linkage that a tourism industry would then support. And they would build a platform to make that kind of thing possible. I get better high-quality information. I'm happier. And the person in Sri Lanka who maybe doesn't have a salary, this is how they make their money. They're happier. Why don't we think about it that way? And then GPT is just a tool in the midst of the available, so that, not everything is a whole 2-pager that someone has got to actually write from scratch, which is maybe too much of an effort. ChatGPT would kind of get you to tune it. So anyway, I could go on, but I just hope you see this is not so frightening and the angst. I understand it, but just step back a little bit and think about what humans really need and what they want and what they can supply.
Again, brilliant insight there, Professor Jordan. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being a ODS speaker for the last few years. Thank you for appearing on the show and taking time out of your busy day. I know you travel a lot, you talk a lot at various events, so thank you so much, and we'll see you again in the near future.
All right, my pleasure. Nice to interact with you, Seamus.
Real pleasure. Thank you. Okay. Bye now.
Bye-bye.